Okay, welcome to this second tutorial here. In this tutorial, we're going to talk about how to take those Display Genie DXF files and convert them into TAP files. And so the software that we use to do that is called V-CarvePro. And in V-CarvePro, what we're going to do first is just click right here, create a new file. And when we click that, we are initiated to set up our job size. So the whole point of V-Carve is to tell the CNC machine exactly what material you're working with and what kind of pattern you want to cut out of that material. So the first thing we need to do is tell it how large our material is. And what we use is 4x8 corrugated plastic that is 4 millimeters thick. So we have 48 inches wide by 96 inches tall. And you see whenever I click that, it makes a 4 foot by 8 foot rectangle here in the workspace. And the thickness, 0.1875 inches, that equals 4 millimeters. So that's good. For the Z0 position, we always zero on the material surface. You can toggle here and see this red datum point switch from the bed to the material surface, but we are always going to use the material surface as our 0 point. For the XY datum, that is where the origin of our tool is going to start. So we always click 0, 0 as our origin point. Some examples, you could choose the center or the top right, but we're always going to use this bottom left hand 0, 0 reference point as our XY datum. So once our job setup is complete, we can say OK. And now what we want to do is we want to import our DXF file. So we can go up here to File, we can go to Import Vectors, and this is that same Display Genie DXF file that we created just earlier in that Display Genie tutorial. So I'll open this up, and you see it populate right here on this 4x8 white sheet that we created. So a couple things I want to talk about over here in this left side about Display Genie. We have the file operations. This is where you can adjust your job size. If you mess one of the parameters up, you can save your file. You can do different things. You can forward, undo, redo. That's what file operations is. This tab right here, create vectors. Sometimes you'll have to go back in and make lines and refill lines. And so that's kind of what this little area is for. Is for creating vectors that you did not import. And next we'll look at the transform objects. So we do use this one a lot. In this tab we can do things like move. We can move this entire structure right here. Select it and press move, and now we have the ability to move this thing around. What we want to do is we can scale it. We don't use this too often because you've already know what size your job is, so we don't use it too often, but you can scale it. Undo that. We can rotate the object. I rotated about 90 degrees. And just press apply to initiate the rotation. So that's a useful tool sometimes when you're trying to get a lot of different little parts onto a sheet in the most efficient way. We can also mirror, so we can mirror to the right, mirror to the left, do different things like that. That's also helpful when you're trying to do a smaller job. This is quite a big job, so we're only going to have one on this sheet. So the next, down here in these edit options, we don't use any of these very much except the trim tool and the fillet tool. The trim tool is just like it sounds. You can use it to cut lines off, trim things. And next we'll look at the fillet tool. So we always fillet tight radiuses, right? We don't like these tight squares. So if you get the fillet tool and you see a 90-degree turn, you can just select it and create a nice smooth transition there. That'll make the drag knife travel through the material a lot easier. So now we'll go ahead and we are going to talk about this layers tab right here. So what V-Carve does when you import a Display Genie DXF is it gives you all of these layers with different vectors on them. Now these light bulbs on the left hand side, that is how you toggle the layers on and off. For example, if I toggle the fold layer on and off, you can see that these, give me 1 second here, let me turn off the fillet, get this back, delete that. So you can see if I toggle the fold layer on and off, those fold lines appear and reappear. If I toggle the cut layer on and off, the cut lines appear and reappear. So these other layers, marker, layer 1, 0, and layer 1, those are just kind of extra layers, filler layers that Display Genie gives us automatically. We don't need them too much. I like to delete them just to get them out of the way. Not necessary. Go ahead and delete those. So now what we want to do is only show our cut layer. So at the end of the day, over here on the right hand side, we're trying to make tool paths. So we're going to end up having 3 tool paths. One of them is going to be a profile cut that the drag knife is going to do on the outside of this pattern to cut this thing out of the plastic. The 2 other tool paths we're going to have are our vertical scores and our horizontal scores. We have 2 different scores there because we have to adjust for the scoring tool we have out there on the CNC machine. It can only orient itself 90 degrees at a time, so you do have to do separate tool paths for vertical scores and horizontal scores. So now we'll go ahead and we're going to start making these tool paths. So I'm going to select my cut layer and have it visible, and we are going to need to fillet all of these right angles, right? Because we do not want sharp edges. So I'm going to hit this tab right here, go back up to the drawing tab, go to the fillet tool, and go down to all these right angles and fillet these things up. Fillet, fillet. There, fillet. Some sharp edges here. Go ahead and fillet those. And then a couple more here, and those are done. So now, after all of our sharp edges are filleted, we can go ahead and select this entire object and hit J on our keyboard to join vectors. This particular one, all the vectors are already joined, but what that does, if there's any gaps, if your fillets create any gaps, or if there's any gaps in Display Genie, you don't want that. You want a continuous, solid pattern. If there's a gap in the pattern, a discontinuity, the drag knife will pick itself up out of the material and plunge itself back in, and it creates not very pretty cuts. So now that we have a nice continuous object that was joined, we can reselect everything. We can go up here to Gadgets, go down to Drag Knife Toolpath, and we are going to set the depth to about 0.27 inches. And we're going to make 2 passes. The blade offset, tolerance angle, those are good to go. You don't ever have to mess with those. The only 2 parameters that you're going to mess with are cut depth and passes. So we'll go ahead and press OK. You'll see these black lines auto-populate around this perimeter. That shows you that the directionality that the drag knife is going to travel around this pattern. And also you see over here in toolpaths that we actually have our first toolpath being created. We can toggle that on and off with the check mark here. And we are going to rename this Profile Cuts. We'll say OK. So there is our first toolpath. So for the time being, I'm going to deselect this to clean up our little area over here. I'm going to go back down here to layers, and we're going to start making our folds, our horizontal and our vertical toolpaths. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a new layer, and I'm going to name it vertical. I'm going to rename this fold layer horizontal. Now this doesn't matter too much. I'm just doing it for clarity. So I'm going to have a horizontal layer and a vertical layer. So right now, if I toggle this layer on and off, there's nothing on the vertical layer, right? So I want to copy everything that's on this horizontal layer, activate the vertical layer. I'm going to turn the horizontal layer off, and I'm just going to Control V to paste that exact same pattern onto the vertical layer. So now we have the vertical layer selected and the vertical layer on. which means I only want to leave the vertical lines. So I will select all these, hit delete, and get rid of those. Now I'm going to go back to the horizontal layer and get rid of all the vertical lines. So we'll go ahead and get rid of all of these. A couple more up here. Okay, so now we have our two different layers. We have a horizontal layer and our vertical layer. So now we need to make the toolpath. So we'll select all of these, hit J on your keyboard to join any unjoined vectors. These are all joined. We'll hit close, go to gadgets, drag knife toolpath. So for horizontal scores, we go 0.27 inches down. Only one pass on those horizontal cuts. You see over here, horizontal is already on there. I'm going to rename it horizontal scores. Oops. We'll say I'm going to name it H scores. That stands for horizontal scores. So now we can go back to our vertical layer. So this is important here. You'll see this joined vectors come into play. You see this gap right here in these lines where all the horizontal scores were. So if we select this, we hit J on our keyboard, you see now we have some open vectors. We have 10 open vectors up here. And if I join those vectors, let me turn off this horizontal layer. So if we join those vectors, now we see a nice continuous line. We want continuity. We do not want breaks in any of these lines. So now we can select these two vertical scores here. Go down to drag knife toolpath. For vertical scores, we go 0.22 inches down. Give it one pass. Say OK. Okay, so now over here in our toolpath pane, this is over here in the top right. It's kind of hidden toolpaths. We see all of the three toolpaths that we just created: profile cuts, horizontal scores, and I'm going to rename this to V-scores. Okay, so whenever we are saving, now we're pretty much done. What we want to do now is save these G-codes. So to save them, you only want to save them one at a time. So make sure you deselect everything you don't want to save. So I want to save profile cuts first. We'll go ahead and go down here in the bottom right, we'll save toolpath. This does create a tap file, so that's what we want. We want a G-code tap file. Profile cut selected, save toolpath again, and we will go to R12 tutorial. We'll already have these things saved from earlier, so we'll call it profile cut tap file. We'll save it. Yes. Now we're going to go down to horizontal scores, deselect profile cuts, make sure that your 8 scores are selected, and we'll press save toolpath. We'll name that horizontal scores, save it. Same thing with vertical here. We'll select it, deselect horizontal, make sure only this is selected, save toolpath as vertical scores, save. There you go. So the reason you don't want to have all of these selected and save them all at one time, because the machine won't stop. It'll do all your profile cuts with the drag knife, and then it'll go and do all your score lines with the drag knife. And you don't want that. You don't want to cut your score lines with a drag knife. You want to score them with the scoring wheel. So that's why you want to make sure that these are separated. They need to be only one saved at a time. So once you have those all saved, you're pretty much done creating G-codes. And now what we want to do is just save this V-Carve file for if we ever want to come back and change something. Say 0.27 inches wasn't deep enough to cut out the plastic. If that's the case, we can come back to this V-Carve file, adjust the settings, and resave that profile cut to be a little bit deeper. So this is the R12 tutorial. I'm going to go ahead and save it as that R12 tutorial. It's a .crv file, which is V-Carve. That's what that stands for. And we'll go ahead and press save. And that's it for using V-Carve to cut out Coroplast designs. There is a little bit more to it whenever we talk about cutting out foams. We play with these toolpath options up here and mess with some different end mill thicknesses and things like that. But that will be in a different tutorial. For this tutorial for corrugated plastic cutting, that's essentially all you need to know. the drag knife tool paths up here, that's where you're going to go to create those tool paths. You want to make sure that these tool paths are always single selected whenever you're saving them. Don't save them all as one, and make sure that you save your VCar files after you're done. That's it. So thanks for listening to this tutorial. In the next one, we will talk about how to use the CNC machine.